This program is a Warren STEIBEL production in association with South Carolina ETV. Funding for Firing Line is made possible by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support is provided by the Annenberg Foundation, the Laurel Foundation, and the Friends of Firing Line.
Well, a year or so ago, there was something of an international debate on the question of whether Columbus had brought Western morality to this hemisphere, or perhaps he had come here to profane natural morality. But in the 500 years since Columbus's fundamental questions were raised, another question was raised, namely, is there such a thing as any sense of morality in human nature? The cynics will deny that there is. Also the nihilist and the positivist. James Q. Wilson argues with them. His book is called The Moral Sense, and Irving Kristol, who does not bestow compliments lightly, says of it that it is already a masterpiece and will become a classic. We're glad to be in on the ground floor of the recognition of a classic. James Wilson is professor of management at UCLA and has been there for 8 years. For 26 years before that, he was professor of government at Harvard. His undergraduate degree is from the University of Redlands, his doctorate from the University of Chicago. He has written 12 books, including Thinking About Crime. He has served on a half-dozen presidential and federal commissions, beginning when he was appointed chairman of the White House Task Force on Crime in 1966. The book, The Moral Sense, focuses on many public questions, and necessarily I have to concentrate on only a few. And I intend to probe the causes of a rise in the rate of single parenthood, which among whites has in the past 30 years tripled, and among blacks risen from 38 to 64%. In his book, Professor Wilson says some things about the institution of marriage which sound suddenly rather alien. Accordingly, I begin by asking, are we prepared to say that parenthood by two people, or I should say more specifically, sponsored by two people, is a natural institution?
I think two-parent families are in fact ordained by nature. That is to say, a man and a woman bring different and complementary skills, tasks, and instincts to the job of raising a child. All of the evidence, an overwhelming amount of evidence now, suggests that a child raised by a single parent is at much greater risk for all manner of social pathologies than one raised by two. Indeed, it even goes beyond the question of how children are raised, because the family is one of the most important devices by which we socialize males in any society. Unsocialized males are roving bands of predators, and I think I can speak some confidence on this matter because I was a young male at one time, and I know what my mind was on most of the time. I'm astonished that my wife's father allowed me to marry her because he too was once a young male, and I know I was worried about what sort of fellow was about to take my daughter from me. It has enormous social...
You're not going to carry this back to Adam, are you?
No, I am not. But the two-parent family is the only device that any culture anywhere in recorded history has found to be a satisfactory way of both organizing society, raising children, and socializing males.
Okay, now I move on to this. Let's assume that this is postulated, i.e. that the overwhelming majority of Americans agree with you. I then move and ask the following question. There has been a deterioration in those forces that encourage the two-parent family. I'd like you to comment on the causes of that deterioration, and then after that on what can be done about it.
Those are very good questions to which I have very unsatisfactory answers, Bill. The deterioration in the two-parent family cannot be ascribed, I think, primarily to changes in the welfare laws. I think those have facilitated it in some instances. I think the welfare rules do make it easier for a young woman to establish a household independent of her parents, independent of the father of her child, have access to housing and medical care. And if this opportunity did not exist, there would probably be fewer single-parent families. But I also think there's a profound cultural force at work, and the cultural force has to do with the relaxation of the publicly sanctioned, intellectually sanctioned respect that family and marriage once enjoyed, such that doing your own thing, finding your own place in the world, exploring alternative lifestyles, not being a prisoner of what is often regarded as bourgeois or Philistine or Victorian morality, has been celebrated. And there are many reasons to be happy that there has been this kind of intellectual assault on the stuffier aspects of Victorian morality, but we have paid an enormous price for it. We've paid the price of allowing some people, 15 and 16-year-old girls primarily, to think that you could have it all, to think that there's an alternative to a family life. And we've encouraged young 15 and 16-year-old boys to think that given this cultural attitude and the availability of contraception, child rearing is simply the responsibility of the girl. If she wants to have a baby, that's her business. She doesn't have to. She knows how to prevent it. I need take no responsibility for it. When I was growing up in North Long Beach, California, half a century ago, there were teenage pregnancies, but they were met with one of three responses. Either the young girl went back to Kansas for 6 months, had the baby, and it was raised by the aunt or the grandmother, or the young man married her, or the young girl's brothers and fathers came around and beat up the boy who was responsible for it. Now, that is a kind of crude way of handling this problem, but it is the way it has always been handled. We now really don't
no longer exist.
No, we really no longer believe in any three of those options.
Yeah. Well, I was reflecting that about 25 years ago, Ingrid Bergman, I guess, shacked up, is the way to put it, with her Italian producer.
Rossellini.
Yeah, Rossellini. So she came over to this country to appear on the Ed Sullivan Show, and there were protests all over on the grounds that that there was a certain complicity involved in giving her that kind of attention under these circumstances. 30 years later, Elizabeth Taylor gets married for the 8th time, and People magazine pays a huge amount of money for the rights single-handedly to photograph the event. There are all kinds of razzle, dazzle, and Nancy Reagan is there, and Gerald Ford is there, and so on and so forth. Now, something happened between episode 1 and episode 2, which it seems to me is illuminated by your book. The social sanction is no longer mobilized. Now, you say a marriage, whether it works or not, we both understand that mutual incompatibility can lead and sometimes should lead to the dissolution of a marriage. But there's got to be, your word, a commitment.
Yes.
Now, how does one revive the sense of commitment so as to make it understandable to the 16-year-old boy and girl?
I don't think that there is a way by plan that society, by which I mean the government acting on behalf of society, can do this. Governments did not create marriage, and I doubt that governments can revive them unaided. One can think of ways in which you might want to redefine the terms under which welfare are given. I think it's a mistake to argue about the amount of money that welfare mothers get, or whether there's a work requirement. Indeed, I'm not quite sure I want the mothers of 1- and 2-year-old children working at all. I think, however, one might say, as Myron Magnet, who I know whose book you have read, says in his book, that we should offer the money to such a young lady, girl, under the assumption, understanding that either she will live with her parents after the child is born, or if for some reason that is an unsatisfactory arrangement, she will live in a group shelter for girls, run preferably by the Sisters of Charity or by the Methodist Church or the YWCA, such that parenting becomes the focus of her life. I despair, however, of thinking a way whereby we can induce young men to take even financial responsibility, to say nothing of moral and nurturant responsibility for the children they father. I've seen efforts around the country, churches that ask young men to stand up and promise that they will sign the birth certificate of their children. That's a step in the right direction. But for the life of me, since a cultural change caused this problem, I do not see how anything other than a cultural change, whose sources I cannot now identify, will rectify the problem.
Well, but you say in your book that what the American people want is, for instance, for the media and the television and to come out on our side, i.e. against Murphy Brown, to de-glamorize the notion that popping a baby here and there, more or less as an accident, is something about which society has no position.
Yes.
Now, as I understand it, you say, indeed, society does have a position. How come it doesn't get expressed by such as People magazine? If there was a touch of censure in the account of Elizabeth Taylor's wedding, I didn't spot it. And I don't see in your book that there's any evidence that there is such censure.
No.
Except in formal text.
Indeed, to go back to the illicit relationship between Ingrid Bergman and Roberto Rossellini, the product of that relationship became an actress in her own right. And though a very gifted young woman starred in...
Is that Candice?
No, this is...
somebody else. Yeah.
Somebody. She starred in a movie called Blue Velvet, which celebrated a degenerate lifestyle in which a pathological killer was described as a person whom you would encounter in small-town America, that life was meaningless, that behind the shrubbery and grass and the bounding Labrador retrievers of middle-class suburban America, there lurked nothing but despair and deceit. And here the daughter of this liaison was the female lead in the movie. I would like to see our government start by doing something very simple, that the President of the United States should, at an appropriate forum, give a speech in which he says illegitimacy is wrong. It's not simply impractical or imprudent or it fails a cost-benefit test, but that it's wrong, morally wrong. That though it may occur on occasion for reasons that are no one's fault, and we have to accept that and help people, nonetheless, it ought to be condemned. That a one-parent family is a bad idea. I don't think any president has said that. I know that university...
So not Grover Cleveland.
Not, yes, certainly not Grover Cleveland. I don't know of universities where that view is the reigning doctrine among those who teach courses on family life and family sociology.
Well, that's pretty quite extraordinary, isn't it?
Yes.
Now, would that have been so 30 years ago?
I think it would be different 40 years ago. My book is an argument addressed to the average citizen that they have a greater moral sense than they might believe, and that they should not allow themselves to be talked out of it by the intellectual chatter they hear. But I also try to indicate how the intellectual chatter has, in fact, talked the spokesman of our leading institutions out of talking about this. For example, on the case of marriage, Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict and others celebrated other cultures where presumably sex was free, unconstrained, people expressed themselves directly. Commitments were, in this view, an invention of Western culture, perhaps desirable at one point in time, but not of supreme importance, and more likely an undesirable invention because they were suppressing the normal, healthy sexuality.
And those generalities have been confuted by subsequent scholarship.
Yes, well, of course, Derek Freeman and other people who've reviewed the analysis and gone back and talked to now the elderly women that Margaret Mead first talked to in the 1930s, discovered that they were putting her on. They were telling her what they thought she wanted to hear, because they are very kind to visiting strangers. But the notion that the world is an immense diversity of inexplicably different cultures, and that there's no good reason for preferring one to the other, this notion of cultural relativism has, I think, paralyzed academia and intellectual leaders generally from coming to grips with the most evident facts of human life.
Well, but since Since you argue that the overwhelming number of Americans agree with you on this basic proposition, why would one be surprised if somebody aspiring for political ascendancy and popularity would shrink from saying that?
It's a very good question. I think that political leaders in this country speak to two audiences. The first audience is the constituency, the people they hope will vote for them. And the second is that audience of the elite, the media, the intellectuals, who characterize them as people. And since much of what the average voter understands about candidates is a second-hand reflection in this two-step flow of influence of how others have characterized them, whether they're sound persons or not, they hedge their bets, and they only speak enthusiastically when they know the media audience and their voting constituency are in agreement, such as unemployment is bad, crime ordinarily is bad.
I think you're absolutely right. Richard Nixon once asked me what I thought was the reason for the special appeal of Ronald Reagan. This is about 1970, something like that. I said, Ronald Reagan's the only man I know who really doesn't care what the New York Times thinks about him. He said, I don't care. I don't care at all. Pointing to John Mitchell. Do I, John? Do I? Absolutely establishing that he did care.
Of course.
And I think it's a very, very shrewd point that even though you're talking about a few 100,000 people maybe at the outside, a president thinks of them as vehicles for the orchestration of the opinion of 200 million people.
I think one of the reasons for the appeal of Ross Perot, a person with whose political views I'm in generally in profound disagreement, nonetheless his appeal is that he doesn't care what the New York Times editorial page thinks either.
That's right.
And he has 19% of the vote, and Rush Limbaugh doesn't think, and I suspect William Buckley doesn't think what the New York Times thinks, but politicians do, and it's an interesting puzzle that ought to be explored in political science 101 courses. Why is it the case that though no one reads the editorial page of the New York Times except those in politics, people should care what it says?
Well, I suppose that has to do with the extraordinary, you being a noble exception, unanimity of opinion among people in the social sciences, in the academy.
That may be one of the reasons, but I think that even by the standards of academia, much of what is reflected in the consensus in the media about leading political figures is regarded as either wrong or superficial. But there is a phenomena that I can't quite understand in which a person's character is assessed by those who write about them and speak about them in ways that are designed to fit the ruling norm at the time, what kind of person we're supposed to have and supposed to like.
Yeah. Well, so the paradigm then becomes the instrument of the editorial writer rather than of society or of human nature. In your book, you tell us that children don't have to be taught, for instance, that they shouldn't hit other children. They know this instinctively, and they know a few other things instinctively, suggesting that although there's plenty of room for refinement at the hands of their parents, much of what they know intuitively. Do we have then a situation in which we have a critical elite counter-demonstrating against healthy intuitions by people?
I think there's a deep intellectual suspicion of many human intuitions. I think, and this is understandable, I am a professor at a university, and our job is to question the conventional wisdom. We often do so in a way that creates a new conventional wisdom, but it is our responsibility, and it's a solemn responsibility, to challenge things by saying, how do you know that's really so?
But even if you go on to prove it?
Even if you go on to prove it. Yeah. But sometimes we challenge things that are not supported by evidence, such as the evident desire of every child growing up to enforce on his or her peers rules of fair play. Adults do not teach children how to play marbles. Children teach others how to play marbles, and out of these rules, they begin to generalize about how other children should treat each other. Now, there is no academic evidence that says this is a good way of organizing a society, because these 6-year-olds do not publish in learned journals. So that when it's challenged, that the idea is challenged that fairness is an intuitive moral sense that we have, there's nothing to defend the proposition, even though someday there may be such evidence. Possibly I have adduced some of it. And so that the argument goes by default. And so fairness, in, let's say, in law schools now, is an invention of bourgeois society designed to preserve property rights. And we'd all be better off if we got rid of those notions.
And you say that the continuing offensive on these morally sound intuitions does issue primarily from the Academy and of course from international ideologues.
I think so,
Rousseau,
and you
Marx,
have to
Freud,
understand that many of the reasons for this academic critique are quite legitimate reasons. When Franz Boas and Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict were writing, they were worried about the specter of fascism in Europe, and they saw this monstrous racist regime coming to power in Germany. And they thought, what we have to do is defend the dignity of mankind, and the way they thought they could do it best was to say, in effect, all cultures are morally equivalent, that one culture is not superior to the other, by which they meant the Aryan culture is not superior to the Jewish or the black culture. Well, that very good motive led to unanticipated consequences.
Nihilism.
Yes, if all cultures are equal, then we are not only precluded from saying that Jews or blacks are inferior, we're also precluded from saying cannibalism is wrong. I don't think they quite meant it, but that's the way it came out.
So yeah, well, you can understand the distinctive pressures of the 30s, but it's difficult to understand the distinctive pressures of the 60s and 70s pushing people in that direction. Or is it just, had they mortgaged all of their credentials and were left in the hands of a kind of a rampant multiculturalism that refused to subordinate?
I think that the good instincts, though misguided activities of Boas and Mead and other 30s intellectuals have been transmuted into a less benignly motivated activity, and I think multiculturalism does express it, that the reigning orthodoxy among many, though not all cultural anthropologists, is that all cultures are equally immune to judgment except your own. Cultural anthropologists are not reluctant to criticize the United States, but they're willing to criticize any other. Indeed, they're prepared to go so far as to say they cannot even be compared. Indeed, some are prepared to say they cannot even be understood. They are unique, ineffable entities that are at best only understood by the people in them. And that is a way, that is a continuation of the assault against reason in the Academy, that we are now, having deconstructed literature, let us now deconstruct culture. They are meaningless to an outside observer, only intelligible to people at that time and place.
Let me ask a question I hadn't thought to ask before. Cui bono, why do they profit from an invalidation even of the reason by which they invalidate?
Well, I think you have to understand that I, like my colleagues in academia, benefit with professional recognition and promotions and tenure and nice jobs and low teaching loads at fine universities by making original statements that seem to advance the reigning paradigm as judged by some academic journal, so that once a movement takes hold, whether it is Marxism or you can imagine such a thing, I suppose, capitalism.
You achieve standing.
You achieve standing, and you achieve standing by pushing the limits of the envelope, constantly saying, not only can we not judge X, we cannot also now judge Y and Z.
And you get notoriety from this.
Yes.
But that notoriety leaves you terribly exposed intellectually and analytically, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
So the more notorious you are, the harder you fall, don't you?
Yes. Of course, but there's a generational cycle here that the desire to reward originality in academia is generationally driven, so that a new generation will come along and make its reputation by being the fastest gun in town and saying, those old fogies, the 60s generation, they got it all wrong. This is the direction we should go.
Well, are people like B.F. Skinner suffering that kind of revisionism?
Oh, yes, I think so. I think that the rigid a stimulus response psychology of the rigidly behavioralist tradition is now beginning to give way as a result of advances in biomedical sciences to a deeper understanding of the structure of the human brain. And I think it's beginning to give way in part to an understanding that people have such a thing as a conscience, which played no role in Skinner's analysis. They said most of our behavior is constrained by internally learned rules, the origin of which we do not fully understand.
Well, does this authorize optimism about the next wave, which will react against the deconstructionism and relativism
I
you're
think
talking
so.
about?
I don't think there's anything permanent in academia, except possibly an overwhelming desire to be left alone while being well-funded. And this is all generally to the good. The problem exists not in academia. This is what we're paid to do. We usually don't do it very well, but it's our special niche in life. The problem arises when people seize on the ruling doctrine of the moment and say that this is a profound and permanent glimpse of the human condition and elevate it to media and political and foundation stature. And that's a mistake.
And the ripple effect causes such phenomena as you address in your book. Thank you, Professor Wilson, author of The Moral Sense. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Next week, the first in a 4-part miniseries that puts health care on the firing line. Host William F. Buckley Jr. is joined by Dr. Richard Janeway, Dr. Marjorie Bowman, Dr. Jeffrey Davis, and Inga Collins to talk about medical specialties giving way to primary care disciplines. Funding for Firing Line was made possible by a major grant from the John M. Olin Foundation, Incorporated. Additional support was provided by the Annenberg Foundation, the Laurel Foundation, and the Friends of Firing Line.